means to moksha, according to Sri Ramana Maharshi, path of self enquiry. The Atma Vichara or the self enquiry is one of the most effective methods which helps one to turn inward and to seek the base of one's individuality. Literally, Atma Vichara means an examination or investigation regarding the nature of the self. It is not the inquiry into the self, but it is the inquiry into the ego. One finds out the real nature of the ego when he reaches its roots, the self. The words inquiry into the self are commonly used while explaining the method of self inquiry. However, they do not mean to say that it is an investigation into the self. Ramana Maharshi himself proclaims that the term Atma or self is seen to be roughly used in various senses, such as man, body, senses, mind, individuality, etc. Herein, the inquiry into the self means the inquiry of the true nature of the ego. Furthermore, in the process of inquiry, the inquirer is the ego, so the inquiry is done by the ego in the realm of the ego. The search is continued till the Supreme Self, the root of the one's individuality, is attained. In the Ramana Gita, the eligibility of the self inquiry is recorded. One is to fit inquire into the self if his mind has purified by the upasanas or by the good deeds performed in the past births. His mind sees the faults in the body and also in the objects. He has no desire of sense objects and he knows the transitory nature of the body. One can recognize his own eligibility through the signs of his own determination about the momentary appearance of the body and the disposition towards the objects. At another place, while describing the practice of the japa, repeated utterance of the holy name, Ramana Maharshi observes that the self inquiry is suited for one whose mind is set for investigation. Such a person cannot perform other practices for a long time. On the other hand, he will start doing investigation leaving these practices. So it can be said that the purified mind and the investigative temperament are the prerequisites of the practice of the self inquiry. The process of the discrimination is unavoidable part of the self inquiry. One examines the I thought, focusing on its own conscious side. To concentrate on the subjective awareness, it is necessary to understand thoroughly what the self is and what the non self is. While discriminating the body from the real I or the self, Ramana Maharshi has frequently explained some traditional ways also. For instance, he proves one's bodiless existence by examining the three states of being, namely Jagrit, Swapna, and Sushupti. Especially, he illustrates the state of deep sleep to establish the continuity of the I awareness in the deep sleep and to confirm the unreality of the body. He uses the method of neti neti, namely discarding of the five sheaths, to turn one's attention to the inner pure self. However, he always warns one not to stop merely on the scriptural or intellectual knowledge of these methods. He strictly bifurcates the self inquiry from the intellectual speculations. He asserts that the intellectual process of discrimination is not itself the self inquiry, but it can only be a part of self inquiry. He further says that one cannot realize the self with the help of the intellect, since the self is the source of the intellect. The intellect only helps in analyzing oneself. After that stage, it merges into the ego and the ego gets dissolved into its source. And the method of self enquiry aims at the total dissolution of the ego. Hence, only the process of discrimination or mere intellectual analysis is not enough for investigating the self, which is hidden in the cover of the ego or the I thought. In the self inquiry, the aham vritti or the I thought is used as a clue to attain the self. In the opinion of Ramana Maharshi, the I thought is the basis of all other objective thoughts. It is the subjective mode of the mind. In other words, it is I am the body thought. It implies the identification of the I with the body. It is the jiva or the concept of individuality for the annihilation of this ego sense. Ramana Maharishi often suggests to hold on the I thought and to search its source. Here, holding the I thought means to fix the attention on finding out the source of the I thought. The self attention doesn't imply that one should constantly think over the I thought as if it is an object. This will only be a deceit since the I is holding another subject because there can be only one subject. One I cannot hold another I. Furthermore, Maharishi says that it is impossible that the ego agrees to kill itself or the mind agrees to kill the mind. One cannot find out ego. Seeking the source of the ego is the only way to suggesting the sense of concentrating the mind power solely on searching the source of the I thought. Normally, the mind power expands into the trinity of knowledge after the rise of the I thought or the ego. The tendency of the mind to transform itself into the objective modes gradually becomes weak. If the subject alone is held, in this step it is tried to find out the true nature of the I, the nature of the I in the absence of the identification. Thus, the self attention directly attacks on the basic identification and bestows self realization on the aspirant. This self attention is just impossible without the mind concentration. Ramana Maharishi explains that the mind will become weak and cannot do the inquiry if it turns outward and fills with innumerable thoughts. The self inquiry is possible only for the one pointed mind. To point out the intensity of concentration in the inquiry, he puts forth an illustration of a person who dives under the deep water to find out a particular valuable thing. Just like this man, if one peeps into the individuality with keen intellect and search the real nature of individuality by controlling the speech and the breath, he can surely attain the source of the ego. Thus, the self inquiry aims at transcending the mind. The analysis of the mind by concentrating on the thoughts is not expected at all while doing the inquiry, but searching the source of the mind is the inquiry. To control the thoughts, Ramana Maharishi also suggests concentrating on the subject of these thoughts and tracing it back to its source. The question, who am I and whence am I, are useful aids in this inquiry. Generally, Maharishi doesn't indicate the difference in these two questions. He advises one to ask oneself the questions, who am I or whence am I, to find out the source of the I thought. However, at some places he has shown the nuisance between these two questions. According to him, the question, who am I, denotes the Gyan or the Vichara, and the question, whence am I, denotes the Dhyana, since it admits the existence of the individual who is seeking its source, the self. In another dialogue, he mentions a sequence in these two questions, which was followed by himself while doing the inquiry. In his view, when one concentrates to locate the birthplace of the ego by the question, Whence am I? The mind becomes still. Thereafter, there remains a very subtle form of I, which also gets merged by questioning, who am I? In the place of the I thought, there remains only the self, the source of the individuality. The description suggests that one tries to reach to the source of one's own individuality by questioning oneself. Hence, am I, the practice helps one to keep away other thoughts. Thereby, the objectifying tendency of the mind becomes weak. The I thought becomes subtler and subtler in its way to the source. Finally, it gets totally vanished by the question, who am I? It is the most intimate stage to the realization while following the path of self enquiry. Here it must be noted that the meaning of the I in the question, who am I, is also the ego and not the self, as told by Maharishi himself. In some of the dialogues, there seems the confusion about the question, who am I, as if it is a kind of mantra. Ramana Maharshi removes this misbelief and says that one should ask this question when other distracting thoughts arise. This question is a means to keep away other thoughts and to search the source of the I thought. Even if so, sometimes Maharishi advises to repeat the I as a mantra by explaining that the I is the first name of the God and one can attain the same goal by its repetition. However, advice is given by him only seeing one's unfitness for the inquiry. He further notes that the question, who am I, is itself a thought. It is used as a tool in the method of self inquiry, and after annihilating all the thoughts, this question also ultimately gets merged into the self. It is also not expected to answer in the form of Soham thought to the question, who am I? One imposes the Sa, that on the Aham, I, while doing the Soham practice, and Ramana Maharishi always rejects to attach any supplement to the I while doing the inquiry. He says that one finds out the identity of Soham. One is not different from the supreme reality in the end of the inquiry. The Soham is the state of the experience and it is not a mere thought. Thus, Maharishi wants to convey that the supreme reality is a thought free state. One has to transcend even the Soham thought to attain that state, and the method of the self inquiry helps one to attain the thought free state. Speaking of the results of the self inquiry, Ramana Maharishi declares that the I thought completely vanishes at the end of the self inquiry. In other words, the realization takes place that there doesn't exist such an entity named the ego or the mind. This path directly suspects the very existence of the mind or the ego and finally makes one realize the truth that the mind or the ego doesn't exist at all. That is why Ramana Maharishi calls it the direct path. When one seeks the birthplace of the I thought with the extremely pure mind, and I thought comes to an end in the self realizing its own nature. It is just like the river that ceases to be separate from the ocean after merging into the ocean. After the annihilation of the I thought, there occurs the Safarana, the ceaseless throbbing of the supreme infinite reality in the form of I. Ramana Maharishi says that the inquiry should be continued up to this moment. After having the self experience, there ends the self inquiry. The state of the absence of all the thoughts is suspected by some people as being a void. Maharishi removes this doubt by affirming that there always remains the witness, the self only on the plane of the mind. The duality of knowledge and ignorance pertains to the mind. The self transcends the mind. In this way, the self inquiry results into the attainment of the self. The firm abidance into the self, thereby all the sorrows come to an end. And this is the highest result of all. Ramana Maharshi describes the self inquiry in relation with other paths also. He shows preeminence of the method of inquiry over other paths on account of its directness. The very basic thing which is frequently told by him is that the subject is the most intimate entity rather than the objects. The core of the subject is the self itself. So it is not correct to think over the objects, ignoring the subject for attaining the self realization. The self realization is only delayed by such objective analysis. In other methods, the practice is done on the assumption of the individuality. On the other hand, the reality of the very ego is examined in the path of self inquiry. So, it is the direct path. The practice of the other methods too doesn't end till the ego survives. Therefore, according to Ramana Maharishi, one has to find out the reality of the ego at the end of all these methods as well. Here lies the salient features of the inquiry in which the reality of the ego is questioned and searched from the very beginning. Therefore, the inquirer finds out that the ego or the mind is a superfluous entity relatively in short time. Thus, here ends the false identification of the self with the body. One realizes the self directly in comparison with the other paths and attain the liberation, which is one's natural state. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.